They made a wish list like they were shopping on Black Friday. But here's the thing. They expected me to pay for it all. I'm Rebecca. And what happened that Sunday evening changed everything between me and my husband's family forever. Picture this. I'm sitting at my in-laws' dining table, the same mahogany table where we'd shared countless family dinners. The smell of Patricia's famous pot roast filled the air, and everything seemed perfectly normal. David, my husband of 3 years, was helping his dad Robert with the dishes while Patricia poured herself another glass of wine. That's when she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper with the kind of smile that should have been my first warning. "Rebecca, honey," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We need to talk about something important." The way she said it made my stomach drop. You know that feeling when someone says they need to talk and you immediately start running through everything you might have done wrong? That was me in that moment. But I had no idea what was coming next. David returned to the table, and I noticed how he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. His father, Robert, cleared his throat and sat down across from me. That same expectant look on his face. Whatever this was, they'd planned it. The three of them had orchestrated this entire evening around this conversation. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light despite the growing knot in my chest. Patricia unfolded the paper with theatrical flair, like she was revealing some grand surprise. "Well, darling, we've been talking as a family, and we've made a list of some things we'd really love to do. You know, experiences and improvements that would benefit everyone." She slid the paper across the table to me, and I picked it up with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat, organized, like a shopping list. But these weren't groceries. Mediterranean cruise for Mom and Dad, $15,000. I read the first item out loud, my voice barely above a whisper. New pickup truck for David, $45,000. The second item made me blink twice. Kitchen renovation, $30,000. By the third item, my hands were shaking. The list went on. New furniture for the living room, a hot tub for the backyard, dental work for Robert, a designer handbag Patricia had been eyeing. The total at the bottom, written in red ink like some twisted Christmas wish list, was over $120,000. I looked up at their expectant faces, and that's when the natural question just tumbled out of my mouth. Where will you get the money for all this? The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's smile widened. Robert leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. And David just stared at his hands. "Your inheritance, sweetie," Patricia said, like she was discussing the weather. "Your grandmother left you quite a fortune when she passed last year. We figured it was time to put it to good use for the family." Have you ever had one of those moments where the world just stops? Where everything you thought you knew suddenly shifts into focus? That was me, sitting there with their wish list in my hands, realizing they'd been planning this conversation for who knows how long. "My inheritance," I repeated slowly, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "Well, yes, dear. You're part of this family now, and families share everything, don't they?" Patricia's tone was so matter-of-fact, like she was explaining basic math to a child. "David is your husband, which means what's yours is his, and what affects him affects all of us." I felt something cold settle in my chest as I looked around the table. They were all watching me with this expectant energy, like I was supposed to be grateful they'd taken the time to make a list instead of just asking for cash, like they'd done me some kind of favor by organizing their greed. That's when I did something that surprised even me. I started to laugh. It wasn't a bitter laugh or an angry laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you suddenly see the punchline of a joke you didn't even know you were part of. "Nice try," I said, still chuckling as I set the paper back down on the table. "But your son won't get a penny because—" The change in their expressions was immediate. Patricia's smile faltered, Robert's confident posture shifted, and David finally looked up from his hands with something like panic in his eyes. "Because what?" Patricia's voice had lost all its sweetness now. "I could see you're probably wondering what I was about to reveal, right? Well, Here's where things get interesting. See, they'd made one crucial mistake in their little family planning session. They assumed I was the same naive woman who'd married their son 3 years ago. They thought I was still the people pleaser who'd say yes to keep everyone happy, who'd hand over my grandmother's legacy without question just to avoid conflict. But I'd learned a few things about protecting myself in those 3 years, things they clearly hadn't bothered to notice. Because I changed something very important last month, I continued, watching their faces carefully. And after tonight, I think that was the smartest decision I've ever made. You could have heard a pin drop in that dining room. The confident energy that had filled the space just moments before evaporated like steam. Patricia set down her wine glass with shaking hands, and Robert's face had gone pale. David was the first to speak. What did you change, Rebecca? And that's when I realized this conversation was about so much more than money. This was about respect, about boundaries, about whether they saw me as a person or just as an ATM with legs. The way they'd planned this whole evening, the casual assumption that my inheritance was somehow their windfall, the complete lack of consideration for my feelings about my grandmother's death or what that money meant to me personally. "I'll explain everything," I said, my voice steady now. "But first, I need to understand something. David, did you know about this list before tonight?" The way his eyes darted away from mine told me everything I needed to know, even before he stammered out his non-answer. My husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect me, had been part of this plan. He'd sat through dinner knowing they were going to ambush me with their financial demands, and he'd said nothing. That's when everything clicked into place. The late-night conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The way Patricia had been extra friendly lately, inviting me for coffee dates and asking detailed questions about my financial situation. The sudden interest in my grandmother's estate that I'd mistaken for genuine concern about my grief. They'd been planning this for months. "I need some air," I said, standing up from the table. "This conversation isn't over, but I need a minute to process what just happened here." As I stepped onto their back porch, pulling out my phone, I could hear urgent whispers from inside. They were panicking now, realizing their carefully laid plans might not unfold the way they'd imagined. But here's what they didn't know. I'd been 3 steps ahead of them the whole time. Remember when I mentioned I'd changed something important last month? Well, it started when I noticed David asking strange questions about my inheritance. Questions about how the money was structured, whether it was in a joint account, what the legal requirements were for accessing it. At the time, I thought he was just trying to be supportive, helping me understand my options. I was so wrong. The red flags started adding up when I overheard a phone call between David and his mother. I'd come home early from work with a migraine, and I heard him in the kitchen saying something about timing and making sure she's comfortable with the idea first. When I asked him about it, he claimed they were planning a surprise for my birthday. That's when I decided to do something I'd never done before. I started paying attention to the details instead of just trusting blindly. I hired a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but one of the best estate attorneys in the city. I wanted to understand exactly what my rights were, what protections I had, and what David could and couldn't access as my spouse. What I learned changed everything. You see, my grandmother wasn't just wealthy, she was smart. Really smart. The inheritance she left me wasn't just a simple bank account transfer. It was structured as a trust with very specific conditions. Conditions that protected it from exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in. But there was more. During our consultation, my lawyer asked me about prenuptial agreements. Did you sign anything before your marriage that might affect your rights to this inheritance? I told him no. We'd never discussed a prenup. David had said they were unromantic, that they showed a lack of trust. He'd convinced me that 2 people truly in love didn't need legal contracts. "Mrs. Martinez," the lawyer said carefully, "I think you might want to review some documents. There are several papers in your file that suggest otherwise." That's when he showed me copies of documents from our marriage license application. Hidden among the standard forms was something I'd signed without reading carefully. A post-nuptial agreement that would give David access to any inheritance I received during our marriage. I'd signed away my financial protection without even realizing it. But here's the thing about good lawyers. They don't just identify problems, they solve them. And the solution he proposed was both simple and brilliant. "We can challenge this post-nup," he explained. "You signed under false pretenses, without proper legal counsel, and without full disclosure of what you were agreeing to. But more importantly, we can restructure your inheritance protection right now, today, before anyone tries to make a claim on it." That afternoon, I signed new papers. Real papers this time. Papers I read every word of. Papers that put my inheritance into an untouchable trust that even divorce couldn't break. And I did something else too. I started recording conversations. So when I stepped back into that dining room, phone in hand, I wasn't the same woman who'd left 5 minutes earlier. I was someone who knew exactly what game they were playing and exactly how to win it. "Okay," I said, settling back into my chair. "Let's talk about this inheritance." Their relief was palpable. Patricia actually clapped her hands together like I'd just agreed to fund their shopping spree. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this, dear," she gushed. "Family is everything, after all." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "Family is everything. That's why I'm curious about something, David. When exactly did you plan to tell me about the post-nuptial agreement you had me sign?" The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. "The what now?" Robert asked, looking confused. "Oh, you didn't tell your parents about that part," I asked sweetly. "About how you tricked me into signing away my inheritance rights without telling me what I was signing. About how you've been planning this financial grab since before my grandmother even died?" Patricia's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. They were all staring at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. "Rebecca, I can explain," David started. "Oh, I'm sure you can," I interrupted. "Just like you can explain why your mother has been asking me detailed questions about my bank accounts for the past 2 months, or why your father casually mentioned that I should look into putting the inheritance money somewhere safe, where it could benefit the whole family." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. 3 people who'd thought they were so clever, so careful in their manipulation, suddenly realizing they'd been caught red-handed. But I wasn't done yet. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice calm and steady. "I'm going to explain to you exactly why your little wish list isn't going to be funded by my inheritance. And then you're going to understand why your son won't be getting a penny." That's when they started begging me. "Please, Rebecca." Patricia's voice cracked as she reached across the table toward me. "We didn't mean anything by it. We just thought, we're family now, and families help each other." "We can work this out," Robert added desperately. "Maybe we got ahead of ourselves with the list, but surely we can find some middle ground." But it was David's pleading that cut the deepest. "Baby, please, you know I love you. This got out of hand, but we can fix it. We can fix everything." I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and saw a stranger, someone who'd been willing to manipulate legal documents, conspire with his parents behind my back, and treat my grief over my grandmother's death as a financial opportunity. "You want to know what I changed last month?" I asked. "I'll show you." I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app, then played back their conversation from just 20 minutes earlier. Every word crystal clear, every assumption and demand perfectly captured. Their faces went from confusion to horror to panic as they listened to themselves, casually discussing how to spend my money, how they'd prepared me for this conversation, how they were certain I'd be reasonable about funding their lifestyle upgrades. "I've been recording our conversations for weeks," I explained as the playback ended. "Ever since I started noticing the questions, the hints, the not-so-subtle suggestions about what I should do with my inheritance." Patricia was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. "You can't use that against us. We're family." "You're right about one thing," I said, standing up and gathering my purse. "This is about family. It's about learning who your real family is when money gets involved." And that's when I told them the truth they never saw coming. "Your son won't get a penny because I've already restructured everything. The inheritance is now in an irrevocable trust that protects it from any claims, including spousal claims. And more importantly," I paused, looking directly at David, "I've already filed for divorce." The silence that followed was deafening. 3 people who'd been so sure of their plan, so confident in their manipulation, suddenly realizing they'd lost everything they'd tried to gain. But the real shock was still coming. The divorce papers hit the table like a thunderclap. David's face went completely white as he stared at the official documents, his name clearly printed as the respondent in Martinez versus Martinez. You already filed?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. 3 days ago, I replied calmly, right after I discovered the truth about our entire marriage. Patricia was hyperventilating now, fanning herself with a napkin. "This is insane, Rebecca. You can't just destroy a family over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me show you what I discovered when I started digging into our finances." I pulled out a folder I'd been keeping in my car, knowing this conversation was inevitable. Inside were bank statements, credit reports, and loan documents that painted a very different picture of my husband than the one I'd been living with. "David, remember that business loan you said you couldn't get approved for last year? The one for your consulting company that never quite got off the ground?" His eyes darted nervously between his parents and me. "What about it?" "Well, it turns out you did get approved. For $75,000, using my inheritance as collateral without my knowledge or consent." The room erupted. Patricia gasped so loudly she started choking. Robert jumped up from his chair, and David just sat there looking like he'd been caught stealing from the church collection plate. "That's impossible," Robert blustered. "You can't use someone else's inheritance as collateral." "You can if they've signed the right documents," I explained, holding up copies of loan paperwork. Documents that were conveniently included in that postnuptial agreement David had me sign. The same agreement where he told me I was just updating our insurance beneficiaries. I could see some of you wondering how I missed all this, right? Well, trust me, I've been asking myself the same question for weeks. But when someone you love tells you that paperwork is just a formality, when they handle all the boring financial stuff so you don't have to worry about it, you trust them. That was my mistake. But here's the really interesting part, I continued, spreading more documents across their mahogany table. That consulting company, it never existed. The $75,000 went straight into your parents' account to pay off the second mortgage they took out on this house. Patricia's crying intensified, but now it sounded more like panic than remorse. "We were going to pay it back. We just needed time to get back on our feet." "Back on your feet from what?" I asked. "Because according to these credit reports, you've been living beyond your means for years. The cruise you took to Alaska last summer, charged to a credit card that's now maxed out. The kitchen renovation you finished 6 months ago, funded by a home equity loan you can't afford. Even that new car sitting in your driveway is 3 payments behind." Robert's face had gone from pale to red. "How did you get access to our financial information?" "I hired a forensic accountant," I said simply. "When you're married to someone who suddenly has access to a substantial inheritance and that someone starts acting suspicious, you get professional help. And what my accountant found was fascinating." I pulled out the final piece of evidence, the one that had kept me awake for 3 straight nights when I first read it. "You've been planning this for over 2 years, since before my grandmother was even diagnosed with cancer." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in their hallway. The forensic accounting shows a pattern of inquiries into my financial background dating back to 2021. credit checks, asset searches, even inquiries to my grandmother's estate attorney. You knew she was dying, and you knew approximately how much I stood to inherit. David finally found his voice. Rebecca, please, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like what? I interrupted. It wasn't like you married me for my potential inheritance. It wasn't like you've been systematically lying to me for our entire relationship. It wasn't like you've already stolen $75,000 from me to bail out your financially irresponsible parents. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at their perfectly manicured yard, the yard they'd paid for with my money. Do you want to know what the worst part is? I asked, still facing away from them. It's not even the money. It's that you made me doubt my own grandmother's love. My voice cracked slightly, and I had to take a deep breath before continuing. When she was dying, she kept telling me about the trust she was setting up, how it would protect me, how it would make sure I never had to depend on anyone who didn't truly love me. And I thought she was being paranoid, maybe a little bitter from her own bad marriage. I turned back to face them, tears in my eyes now, but my voice steady. She wasn't paranoid. She was experienced. She knew exactly what kind of people would come crawling out of the woodwork when money was involved. Patricia tried one more time to salvage the situation. Honey, we do love you. We made mistakes, yes, but we're family. Families forgive each other. You're right about forgiveness, I agreed. But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to keep enabling your behavior or pretending this marriage was ever real. I gathered my papers and put them back in the folder. David, your things are packed and waiting on the porch at home. I've changed the locks, and my attorney will be in touch about the asset division. Wait, he called out as I headed for the door. What about the loan? If you leave me, I'll lose everything. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. That's not my problem anymore. You should have thought about that before you decided to commit fraud. Fraud? Robert's voice was sharp with fear. Using someone's assets as collateral without their knowledge or consent is fraud, I explained. Forging signatures on financial documents is fraud. Lying about the nature of legal agreements is fraud. Should I go on? The reality of their situation was finally sinking in. Not only were they not getting my inheritance money, but they were facing potential criminal charges for what they'd already taken. Please, Patricia begged, following me to the door. Don't destroy our family over this. We can make it right. I stopped and looked back at the three of them. David with his head in his hands, Robert calculating frantically on his phone, Patricia clutching her pearls like they were a lifeline. You destroyed this family the moment you decided I was worth more to you as a bank account than as a person, I said. I'm just refusing to fund the destruction anymore. That was 6 months ago. The divorce was finalized last month, and let me tell you, the asset division was even more satisfying than I'd imagined. See, here's what my forensic accountant discovered that I hadn't mentioned in that final confrontation. David hadn't just taken $75,000. Over the course of our marriage, between the fraudulent loan, unauthorized credit cards opened in my name, and gifts to his parents that came from joint accounts funded primarily by my salary, they'd taken over $200,000. But my grandmother's trust had been smarter than any of us realized. It included provisions for recovering fraudulent transfers and identity theft. Every penny they'd stolen was not only returned, but came with interest and penalties. David had to sell his car to pay his share of the restitution. Patricia and Robert had to take out a reverse mortgage on their house. The wish list that had started this whole mess, it became a debt list instead. The best part? I didn't have to lift a finger for any of it. My grandmother had built protections into that trust that activated automatically when fraud was detected. She really had thought of everything. These days, I'm living in a beautiful apartment downtown, completely funded by my own income. The inheritance sits safely in its trust, growing and waiting for when I decide how to use it for something meaningful. Maybe a scholarship fund in my grandmother's name, maybe a nonprofit to help other women protect themselves from financial abuse, Maybe just a really nice vacation to somewhere I've always wanted to go, without having to ask anyone's permission or justify the expense. The irony isn't lost on me that David's family destroyed their relationship with me, trying to get access to money they never would have seen anyway. Even if I'd been the naive pushover they thought I was, even if I'd agreed to fund their wish list, the trust structure would have prevented it. My grandmother had specifically included provisions that prohibited using trust funds to pay other people's debts or fund their lifestyle choices. She really had known exactly what kind of people would try to take advantage of me. Last week, I ran into Patricia at the grocery store. She looked older, tired, stressed in a way that seemed to have settled into her bones. She saw me coming down the cereal aisle and actually tried to hide behind a display of orange juice, but I walked right up to her. "Hello, Patricia," I said calmly. She looked like she was debating whether to run or faint. "Rebecca, how are you?" "I'm doing really well," I said honestly. "How are you and Robert managing?" Her eyes filled with tears. We're getting by. The house is worth more than we owe on it, so we're not going to lose it. And David found a job, finally. It doesn't pay much, but..." She trailed off, looking embarrassed and defeated. "I'm glad you're managing," I said, and I meant it. I never wanted anyone to lose their home or be unable to pay their bills. "Then why..." she started, but I held up my hand. "I wanted to be treated like a person instead of a resource," I said simply. "I wanted a husband who married me because he loved me, not because he'd researched my financial prospects. I wanted in-laws who cared about my happiness, not just my bank account." She nodded, fresh tears flowing. "We did love you, Rebecca. We still do. We made terrible choices." "You did," I agreed. "But that doesn't mean the consequences weren't fair." I started to walk away, then turned back. "Patricia, if you really loved me, you would have been happy that I had financial security. You would have been protective of it, not plotting to spend it. That's the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can do for them." I left her standing there in the cereal aisle, probably thinking about that distinction for the first time in her life. The thing about financial abuse, and that's what this was, even though I didn't recognize it at the time, is that it's rarely just about the money. It's about control, about reducing someone to their usefulness, about convincing them that their value lies in what they can provide rather than who they are. David didn't just steal money from me. He stole 3 years of my life, 3 years where I could have been building a real relationship with someone who actually wanted to be with me. His parents didn't just see me as a daughter-in-law. They saw me as a financial plan with a person attached. But here's what they never understood. My grandmother didn't leave me that inheritance to make me attractive to gold diggers. She left it to give me the freedom to walk away from people who only valued me for what I could give them. And that's exactly what I did. These days, I'm dating again. Carefully, slowly, with full financial transparency from day one, I've learned to watch for the subtle signs. The questions about my living situation that probe for financial details, the suggestions about expensive dates that test my willingness to spend, the casual comments about future plans that assume unlimited resources. I've also learned to trust my instincts. When something feels off, when someone seems more interested in my lifestyle than my personality, when the conversation always seems to drift back to money and possessions, I listen to that voice now. My grandmother used to say that money doesn't change people, it reveals them. She was right about that too. The inheritance revealed that David was someone who would rather commit fraud than work for his own success. It revealed that his parents were people who would rather manipulate their son's wife than live within their means. And it revealed that I was stronger than any of us had realized. So when people ask me if I regret the way things ended, if I think I was too harsh or moved too quickly, I tell them about that wish list. I tell them about discovering that my entire marriage was based on a lie. I tell them about the relief I felt when I realized I didn't have to pretend anymore that their greed was normal family behavior. And then I tell them the most important thing I learned: your inheritance isn't just money. It's a legacy of love, protection, and wisdom from someone who wanted to make sure you never had to compromise your dignity for security. My grandmother gave me more than financial freedom. She gave me the power to choose relationships based on love rather than need, to set boundaries without guilt, and to walk away from anyone who saw me as a means to an end rather than an end in myself. That's worth more than all the wish lists in the world. Now, I keep a copy of their original list in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of their greed, but as a reminder of my own worth. Every time I'm tempted to doubt myself, to wonder if I was too harsh or too quick to judgment, I read that list again. $120,000 worth of demands from people who had never once asked what I wanted, what I needed, or what would make me happy. And then I remember that the best decision I ever made was refusing to fund their dreams at the expense of my own dignity. Because at the end of the day, it was never about the money, it was about respect. And some things, no matter how much someone begs, simply aren't for sale.